October 24th, 1997. Hartford, Connecticut. A young mother left home with her 4-year-old daughter to buy milk and diapers. She carried $10. She told her sister she'd be right back. They walked 4 blocks to the store, bought what they needed, but never arrived. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, 2 people simply vanished. What makes a mother and child disappear in broad daylight on a route they walked every day? Hartford, Connecticut, in the late 1990s, was a city shaped by waves of immigration and the decline of American manufacturing. The state capital sat at the center, with its imposing government buildings and the headquarters of insurance companies that had made Hartford wealthy decades earlier. But just blocks from that formal downtown were neighborhoods where working-class families, many of them recent immigrants, built their lives in aging apartment buildings with peeling paint and narrow hallways. The Park Street corridor was the beating heart of Hartford's Puerto Rican community. It was a place where Spanish was spoken as often as English, where corner stores sold plantains and malta and pastelitos, where families knew each other by name, and children played on the front stoops while their mothers watched from second-floor windows. There was a rhythm to life in this neighborhood, a sense of collective responsibility. People looked out for each other's children. They shared food when money was tight. They greeted the same faces every day on their way to work or to the bodega. And they trusted the police officers who patrolled these streets, men and women in uniform who were supposed to be protectors, part of the fabric of the community rather than outsiders passing through. Rosa Delgado was 21 years old in the fall of 1997. She was a single mother raising 2 young daughters in a small Park Street apartment she shared with her sisters. Her older daughter, Rose Camacho, was 4 years old. Everyone in the neighborhood called her Rosita. She had dark hair like her mother and a quiet, gentle temperament. Rosa's younger daughter, Alicia, was only 5 months old, still an infant entirely dependent on her mother's care. Rosa didn't work outside the home. She had no formal employment, no income of her own. She relied entirely on her older sister, Antonia Delgado, for financial support. Antonia worked and paid the bills, and in return, Rosa took care of the household and the children. It was an arrangement common among immigrant families in the neighborhood, sisters living together, pooling their resources, sharing the burden of raising children in a city where rent was high and wages were low. Rosa's role in the family was clear. She was the caretaker, the one who stayed home while others worked. She was a familiar presence on Park Street, often sitting on the front steps of the apartment building with Rosita playing nearby and baby Alicia cradled in her arms. Neighbors greeted her when they passed. She greeted them back, always polite, always soft-spoken. She had lived in this area for most of her life. The few blocks around Park Street were not just familiar to her. They were her entire world. The father of Rose was a man named Julio Camacho. He was 37 years old and worked as a police officer for the Hartford Police Department. He had met Rosa in 1992 when he was patrolling the Park Street neighborhood as part of his regular duties. At the time, Rosa was 16 years old, a teenager still living with her family. Their relationship began during those patrol shifts. By the time Rosa turned 17, she had given birth to their daughter on June 7, 1993. The relationship between Rosa and Julio was complicated in ways that everyone in the neighborhood understood, but rarely discussed openly. Julio was married. His wife, Deborah Camacho, was also a police officer in Hartford, working the same department, wearing the same uniform. Despite this, Julio had fathered a child with Rosa, and court records from April 1994 showed that he had been legally recognized as Rosa's father. The court had ordered him to pay $188 per week in child support. At the time, Julio had not contested the ruling. He had accepted the responsibility, at least on paper, but his involvement in Rosa's life was inconsistent at best. Sometimes he visited Rosa at the Park Street apartment during his shifts. Sometimes he called to check in. The Delgado sisters knew who he was and saw him around the neighborhood from time to time, but they didn't trust him. Rosa herself said very little about the relationship. She was not the type to complain or confide in others. She was quiet by nature, the kind of young woman who kept her troubles to herself and focused entirely on caring for her children. October 24th, 1997, was an ordinary Friday afternoon in Hartford. The weather was mild for late autumn, the kind of day when people were still out on the streets in the early evening. Rosa needed to buy milk and diapers for baby Alicia. It was a simple errand, the kind she had done dozens of times before without incident. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, she told her sister Edith that she was going to the store and asked her to watch Alicia for a few minutes. She took Rose by the hand and left the apartment. She carried about $10 in cash, possibly less. She didn't bring a purse. She didn't pack any extra clothes or take her identification. She wasn't planning to be gone long. She was walking to JJ's Grocery on Madison Avenue, a corner store about 4 blocks away that she visited regularly, and she intended to be back home within 20 minutes at most. It was still daylight outside. The streets were familiar. There was no reason for anyone in the family to be concerned. The Delgado sisters began to worry as soon as the sun went down on October 24th, 1997. Rosa had left the apartment around 4:30 in the afternoon to buy milk and diapers, a simple errand that should have taken 20 minutes at most. By 6 o'clock, she still hadn't returned. By 7, the family was making phone calls to relatives and neighbors, asking if anyone had seen her. By 8, they knew something was seriously wrong. Rosa would never stay away this long without explanation. She would never leave baby Alicia for hours without telling anyone where she was going. The sisters walked the route from their Park Street apartment to JJ's Grocery on Madison Avenue, looking for any sign of Rosa and Rose. They found nothing. No one they spoke to had seen them after the grocery store owner watched them walk north on Madison Avenue that afternoon. The family contacted the Hartford Police Department that evening to report Rosa and Rose missing. The officer who took the report asked the standard questions. How old was Rosa? When was she last seen? Did she have any reason to leave on her own? Did she have family or friends outside Hartford? The Delgado sisters answered each question with growing frustration. Rosa was 21. She was last seen around 4:45 in the afternoon. She had no reason to leave. She had a 5-month-old baby at home. She had no friends outside the neighborhood, no money for travel, no car, no plan to go anywhere. The officer took notes and filed the report, but the response was measured. People sometimes stayed out longer than expected. Disputes happened between family members. Maybe Rosa had gone to visit someone and lost track of time. The police would look into it, but there was no immediate search, no alert sent out to neighboring towns, no sense of urgency. The initial investigation began slowly. Officers checked the route from the Park Street apartment to JJ's Grocery, a distance of just 4 blocks. They spoke to the grocery store owner, Luis Nunes, who confirmed that Rosa and Rose had been in his store around 4:45 on the afternoon of October 24th. He described what Rosa had purchased: milk, diapers, a few pieces of candy. He said she seemed calm and normal, showing no signs of distress. He watched her leave and saw her walking north on Madison Avenue with Rose beside her, heading in the direction of home. That was the last confirmed sighting. Investigators spoke to neighbors along Madison Avenue and Park Street, asking if anyone had seen Rosa and Rose after they left the grocery store. No one had. There were no witnesses who reported seeing them get into a car, no one who saw them talking to anyone suspicious, No reports of any kind of struggle or disturbance in the area that afternoon. Before Rosa reached the grocery store, a neighbor saw her and Rose standing on the sidewalk outside an apartment building on Carpenter Avenue, just around the corner from their own building on Park Street. They were talking with Julio Camacho. He was standing near his mother's apartment, a place he was known to visit from time to time. The conversation appeared brief and unremarkable to the witness who saw it. There was no sign of an argument, no raised voices, nothing that suggested conflict or distress. Julio was Rosa's father. It wasn't unusual for him to be in the neighborhood. The witness thought nothing of it and continued on their way. Rosa and Rose walked on toward the grocery store. At approximately 4:45 in the afternoon, Rosa and Rose walked through the front door of JJ's Grocery on Madison Avenue. The owner, Luis Nunes, recognized Rosa immediately. She was a regular customer, someone he saw several times a week. He watched as she moved through the small aisles of the store, picking up a container of milk from the refrigerator case, a package of diapers from the shelf, and a few pieces of candy for Rose. Nunes greeted her warmly and asked how baby Alicia was doing at home. Rosa answered in Spanish, "Bien," meaning good. Her tone was calm. Her demeanor was no different from any other day. There was no sign of worry or fear in her voice, no indication that anything unusual had happened or was about to happen. She paid for the items with the cash she had brought, thanked Nunes, and left the store with Rose walking beside her, holding her hand. Nunes watched them through the front window as they turned north on Madison Avenue, heading in the direction of their apartment on Park Street. It was a straight route home, less than 4 blocks away. The walk should have taken no more than 10 minutes. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rosa Delgado and her 4-year-old daughter, Rose Camacho. They were walking home in broad daylight on a Friday afternoon, on a route they had taken countless times before, carrying milk and diapers they had just purchased. A mother and daughter on a simple errand that was supposed to end with them walking back through the door of their Park Street apartment. But they never arrived. Edith Delgado waited at home with 5-month-old Alicia. The afternoon turned to evening. The sun set over Hartford. Hours passed. By nightfall, the Delgado sisters knew with certainty that something was wrong. Rosa would never stay away this long without telling anyone. She would never leave her infant daughter for hours without explanation, without a phone call, without a word. The sisters began making calls to relatives, asking neighbors if anyone had seen Rosa and Rose that evening. No one had. They retraced the route from the apartment to JJ's Grocery, walking the same sidewalks Rosa and Rose had walked just hours earlier, looking for any sign of where they might have gone. There was nothing. Later, when police began asking questions, Julio Camacho told investigators that he had seen Rosa and Rose in the Park Street area on the afternoon of October 24th. He confirmed the encounter that the neighbor had witnessed outside his mother's apartment on Carpenter Avenue. But when investigators asked him what had been discussed, where Rosa and Rose had gone after that conversation, or what had happened next, Julio offered no clear explanation. He simply said he didn't know where they went. He didn't know what had happened to them. Then, just weeks after Rosa and Rose disappeared, something happened that stunned even those who had been closely following the case. Julio Camacho and his wife, Deborah Camacho, who was also a police officer with the Hartford Police Department, retained a lawyer and began legal proceedings to have Julio relieved of his child support obligations for Rose. They hired an attorney named John Forrest and filed documents with the court requesting that Julio's weekly child support payments be reduced or eliminated entirely. They also requested that the court order a DNA test to verify whether Julio was actually the biological father of Rose, despite the fact that he had not contested paternity when the original child support order had been issued back in 1994. A hearing on these matters was scheduled for January 1998, just a few months after Rosa and Rose had vanished. Nowhere in the legal filings submitted to the court was there any mention of the fact that Rose Camacho and her mother were missing and had been for weeks. The Delgado family was shocked and outraged. Antonia Delgado, Rosa's older sister who had been financially supporting the family, spoke publicly about her anger and disbelief. She told reporters that every day people asked her about Rosa and Rose. Everywhere she went, to work, to the grocery store, walking down the street, she saw their photographs on posters and flyers. Everyone wanted to know if there was any news, if the police had found anything, if Rosa and Rose were safe. But Antonia had heard nothing from investigators. There were no updates, no progress reports, no answers. And now, she said, the father of the missing child was taking her to court to stop paying child support for that child. "My sister is missing with his kid," Antonia told a reporter, "and he's suing me." The timing seemed incomprehensible. If Julio truly did not know what had happened to Rosa and Rose, if he was genuinely concerned about his daughter's safety and well-being, why would his immediate focus be on eliminating his financial responsibility for her? The Delgado sisters refused to stay silent. They continued to call the Hartford Police Department daily, demanding updates on the investigation and asking what was being done to find Rosa and Rose. When they felt the police were not doing enough, they took matters into their own hands. They printed flyers with photographs of Rosa and Rose and posted them throughout Hartford, on telephone poles, in store windows, at bus stops, anywhere people might see them. They spoke to reporters from local newspapers and television stations, publicly criticizing the police department's slow and inadequate response to the disappearance. The media attention gradually forced the department to acknowledge that the case was being actively investigated, but by that point, the initial critical period had already passed. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into the disappearance of Rosa Delgado and Rose Camacho began to slow. The case had no physical evidence of any kind. There was no location where investigators could search for clues. There were no remains, no biological evidence, no signs of violence anywhere along the route Rosa and Rose had walked on October 24th. There were no abandoned personal belongings, no discarded clothing, nothing that could be analyzed in a laboratory or used to build a case. Technology in the late 1990s was limited in ways that would seem almost unimaginable today. There were no surveillance cameras in the Park Street neighborhood, no security footage from nearby businesses, no cell phone records to track movements or communications. The grocery store where Rosa had made her last purchase had no cameras. The streets she and Rose had walked had no cameras. The investigation relied almost entirely on witness statements and movement records, and both were sparse. The only confirmed witness after Rosa left her apartment was Luis Nunes, the grocery store owner, who had watched Rosa and Rose walk away from his store heading north on Madison Avenue. After that, there was nothing. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they began to examine the background of Julio Camacho more closely. What they found painted a troubling picture. Court records revealed that Julio had 4 children with 4 different women. In addition to Rose, whose mother was Rosa Delgado, Julio had fathered children with 3 other women at different points in his life. He was also helping to raise children from his wife Deborah's previous marriage, adding even more complexity to his family situation. But the most disturbing detail in Julio's past came from January 1989, when he had been terminated from the Hartford Police Department. The termination came after Julio was arrested and charged with third-degree force against his ex-wife during a domestic dispute. The charge was serious, and the department had initially decided that termination was the appropriate response. But 1 month later, the police chief at the time, Bernard Sullivan, had reversed that decision. Julio was reinstated to the force, and the termination was changed to a suspension. He had been allowed to return to his job as a police officer despite the charge. Investigators also learned more about how Julio's relationship with Rosa had begun. He had met her in 1992 while patrolling the Park Street neighborhood as part of his regular duties. At that time, Rosa was 16 years old, still a teenager living with her family. Julio was a married police officer in his 30s. The relationship had developed during those patrol shifts, with Julio stopping by the area where Rosa lived, talking to her on the street, seeing her regularly over a period of months. Rosa became pregnant when she was 16. She gave birth to Rose on June 7, 1993, when she was 17 years old. In 1994, the state of Connecticut took Julio to court over the issue of child support. The court ruled that Julio was the father of Rose and ordered him to pay $188 per week to support the child. At that time, Julio had not contested the ruling. He had accepted the court's determination of paternity and had been making the required payments until Rosa and Rose disappeared. There was another woman in Julio's past whose story bore striking similarities to Rosa's. Her name was Celeste Morales. She was 22 years old when she met Julio Camacho in 1991. She had not sought him out. He had come to her. Celeste lived in a Charter Oak apartment complex, and one night her ex-boyfriend had thrown bricks through her windows in an act of aggression and intimidation. The Hartford police responded to the call, and the officer who arrived at her door was Julio Camacho. That was how they met. Julio told Celeste that he and his wife Deborah had separated, that the marriage was over. It was a lie. The relationship continued, and on July 15, 1992, Celeste gave birth to Julio's son, whom she named Julio Camacho Jr. During her pregnancy, Celeste said, Julio was rarely around. After the baby was born, he disappeared almost entirely. Celeste later told investigators that Julio had denied he was the father of her son. He refused to acknowledge the child or provide any support. It was only after Celeste pursued legal action and demanded a DNA test that paternity was proven. In July 1996, a court ordered Julio to pay $600 per month in child support for Julio Jr. Celeste was bitter about the experience. During my pregnancy, he was never around, she told police. Once I had my son, it was a total no-show. I'm just glad I'm through with him. Deborah Camacho, Julio's wife, was also a police officer with the Hartford Police Department. She was 34 years old at the time of Rosa's disappearance. The Delgado sisters told investigators that in the weeks and months before Rosa went missing, Deborah had frequently called the Park Street apartment asking if Julio was there. The calls were not friendly. Deborah was looking for her husband, checking to see if he was with Rosa. The sisters understood what the calls meant. Deborah knew about Rosa. She knew about the child. She knew that her husband was still involved with the young woman he had met while on patrol. 1 week before Rosa disappeared, Deborah called Antonia Delgado and made a statement that would later seem significant. She told Antonia, Julio doesn't want the daughter. She said he wanted nothing to do with Rose anymore. It was a clear message, and it came just days before Rosa and Rose vanished. Then, in the days immediately before October 24th, something happened at Deborah Camacho's home in Cromwell, a town just outside Hartford. Police in Cromwell responded to a medical emergency call at the residence. When they arrived, they found Deborah at home with what was described as a note expressing intent to end her own life. The exact contents of the note were not made public, but the situation was serious enough that the Hartford Police Department took immediate action. Deborah's service weapon was confiscated. She was placed on leave and did not return to work. The timing of this incident, occurring just days before Rosa and Rose disappeared, raised questions among investigators, but Deborah, like her husband, was not providing answers. After Rosa and Rose went missing, Julio's behavior became even more difficult to explain. He stopped calling the Delgado family entirely. He had called occasionally before the disappearance, checking in on Rose or speaking briefly with Rosa. But after October 24th, the calls stopped completely. Julio never once called the Delgado sisters to ask what had happened to Rosa. He never asked if there had been any news, if the police had found anything, if anyone had seen his daughter. He never expressed concern or offered to help with the search. This silence was noted by investigators as highly unusual. It was the kind of behavior that did not fit with a father who was genuinely worried about his missing child. Detectives noted this in their reports. It was abnormal. It was suspicious. But it was not, by itself, evidence of wrongdoing. The case was beginning to go cold. Weeks had turned into months with no new leads and no breakthroughs. In January 1998, 3 months after the disappearance, the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved in the case. The FBI handles cases that cross state lines or that involve potential abduction, and the disappearance of Rosa and Rose met the criteria for federal involvement. The FBI began treating the case as a possible taking. They brought additional resources and investigators to the effort, coordinating with the Hartford Police and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But despite this expanded effort, there were no new leads. No witnesses came forward with additional information. No physical evidence was discovered. The trail had gone completely cold. Julio Camacho's attorney, William Giras, became the primary voice speaking on behalf of his client as the investigation continued into early 1998. Giras gave statements to the media explaining why Julio had stopped cooperating with investigators. He cooperated initially, Giras told reporters. The authorities weren't satisfied and are not about to exonerate him, so I've ordered him not to cooperate any further. Giras was clear about his client's position. Julio denied any involvement in the disappearance of Rosa Delgado and Rose Camacho. He maintained that he had seen them briefly on the afternoon of October 24th, 1997, but had no knowledge of what happened to them afterward. Giras advised Julio not to speak to police again without legal representation present, and Julio followed that advice completely. He refused all requests for additional interviews with investigators. He also declined to speak with journalists or reporters who sought comment about the case. His silence was absolute. In January 1998, just 3 months after Rosa and Rose disappeared, Julio Camacho and his wife, Deborah, moved forward with the legal action they had initiated weeks earlier. They had retained attorney John T. Forrest to represent them in family court. The purpose of the legal action was twofold. First, they were asking the court to reduce or eliminate the child support payments that Julio had been ordered to pay for Rose Camacho. The original court order from 1994 had required Julio to pay $188 per week. Now, Julio and Deborah wanted that obligation reduced or removed entirely. Second, they were requesting that the court order a DNA test to verify whether Julio was actually the biological father of Rose. This request was particularly unusual, given that Julio had not contested paternity when the original child support order was issued in 1994. He had accepted the court's determination at that time without objection. But now, 3 years later, and just months after Rose and her mother had vanished, Julio was suddenly questioning whether he was the father at all. The legal documents filed with the court argued that Julio had not received proper notice of the 1994 hearing that had established his paternity and set the child support amount. According to the filings, this lack of proper notice meant the original order should be reconsidered. What made the filing especially striking was what it did not mention. Nowhere in the legal documents was there any reference to the fact that Rose Camacho and her mother, Rosa Delgado, were missing. There was no acknowledgement that the child for whom child support was being disputed had not been seen in months. There was no mention of the ongoing investigation or the fact that federal authorities were now treating the case as a possible abduction. The legal filing proceeded as if Rose were simply living elsewhere with her mother, rather than missing under circumstances that strongly suggested foul play. The reaction from the Delgado family was one of shock and anger. Antonia Delgado, who had been financially supporting Rosa and the children before the disappearance, spoke publicly about her frustration. "Every time I go to work, everyone asks me, 'How's your sister? Have they found your sister?' she told a reporter. "When I go grocery shopping, I see her pictures, and I haven't heard a thing." The constant reminders of Rosa and Rose were everywhere, on telephone poles, in store windows, at the police station. But there was no news, no progress, no answers. And now, Antonia said, the father of the missing child was taking her to court. "My sister is missing with his kid, and he's suing me?" The question captured the incomprehensibility of the situation. If Julio was genuinely concerned about his daughter's safety and well-being, why would his focus be on eliminating his financial responsibility for her? Despite the lack of concrete leads, the Delgado family clung to fragile threads of hope. They continued to receive occasional phone calls at their homes, anonymous calls where no one spoke on the other end of the line. The calls were unsettling, but they also represented a possibility, however slim, that someone out there knew something about what had happened to Rosa and Rose. The family also consulted with a spiritual advisor, a friend from Puerto Rico, who claimed to have psychic abilities. This friend told the Delgado sisters that Rosa and Rose were still alive. According to the spiritual advisor, they were being held somewhere, hidden away in a small apartment in an unknown location. The family wanted desperately to believe this. The alternative, that Rosa and Rose were gone permanently, was too painful to accept. So they held on to the hope that somewhere, somehow, Rosa and Rose were alive and might one day be found. The involvement of federal authorities brought additional resources to the investigation, but it did not bring immediate results. The FBI had officially taken over the case, treating it as a suspected abduction. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a non-profit organization that assists in cases involving missing children, assigned a case manager named Charles Pickett to coordinate efforts to locate Rose. Pickett worked closely with both the FBI and the Hartford Police Department, reviewing all available evidence and exploring every possible lead. But Pickett also expressed frustration with the obstacles the investigation was facing. In a statement to the press, he addressed the issue of Julio and Deborah Camacho's refusal to cooperate. "If they're not suspects," Pickett said, "they sure throw a wrench in it we've got to buffer through." The statement was diplomatic but pointed. Whether or not Julio and Deborah were ultimately responsible for what happened to Rosa and Rose, their refusal to assist investigators was making it significantly harder to determine the truth. As the investigation continued, more details about Julio Camacho's conduct as a police officer came to light. Hartford Police Chief Joseph F. Cruwell, Jr. was asked about the relationships Julio had formed with women he encountered while on patrol. Cruwell's response suggested he had not been aware of the pattern until reporters brought it to his attention. "Obviously, when you come to work, it's not a dating service," Cruwell told the press. "You're here to do police work. I'd need more facts, but it could cause an officer some problems. This is the first I've heard of it." The statement was remarkable for what it revealed. The chief of police had apparently been unaware that one of his officers had fathered multiple children with women he had met while patrolling city neighborhoods, including a teenager who had been 16 years old when the relationship began. The revelation raised questions about supervision and accountability within the department. How had Julio's behavior gone unnoticed or unreported for so long? Why had no one raised concerns about an officer who appeared to be using his position to form personal relationships with vulnerable women in the community? The case remained at a standstill. Investigators had interviewed everyone who had seen Rosa and Rose on October 24th. They had checked hospital records, bus stations, train stations, and airports. They had contacted police departments in surrounding towns and states. They had distributed flyers and posters throughout Connecticut and beyond. They had followed up on every tip that came in through the hotline. But none of it had produced a single solid lead. There was no physical evidence. No one had come forward with information about a vehicle or a suspicious person seen in the area that afternoon. No one had reported seeing Rosa or Rose after they left the grocery store. There was no confession, no admission of guilt from anyone. There were only the facts that investigators had established in the first days of the case. Rosa and Rose had been seen talking briefly with Julio Camacho. They had gone to buy milk and diapers, and then they had vanished. What remained was a series of troubling questions with no clear answers. There was a police officer who had been the last known person to see the missing mother and child, but who refused to provide any meaningful information about that encounter. There was a wife who had been in psychological distress just days before the disappearance, and who also refused to cooperate with investigators. And there were two people, a young mother and her 4-year-old daughter, who had disappeared without a trace in broad daylight from a familiar neighborhood. No direct evidence, no confession, no remains found. Just a police officer who refused to answer questions, a wife in an unstable psychological state, and two individuals, a mother and her daughter, gone without any trace. After months of investigation with no resolution, analysts and investigators began examining the case through the lens of probability. What were the most likely explanations for how a young mother and her 4-year-old daughter could vanish without a trace from a familiar neighborhood in broad daylight? Several scenarios were considered, each evaluated based on the available evidence and the behavior patterns typical in missing persons cases. The first scenario that investigators considered was that Rosa and Rose had been taken by a stranger, someone unknown to them who had encountered them by chance on the afternoon of October 24th. This type of random abduction, while certainly possible, seemed increasingly unlikely as the investigation progressed. Rosa and Rose had been walking on streets they knew well, in a neighborhood where Rosa had lived for years. Park Street was not an isolated area. It was a busy residential corridor with apartment, buildings, stores, and steady foot traffic throughout the day. If a stranger had forced Rosa and Rose into a vehicle, or taken them by force, the likelihood that someone would have witnessed it was high. Neighbors sat on their stoops. People walked to and from work. Children played outside. Yet no one reported seeing any suspicious vehicles in the area that afternoon. No one reported seeing Rosa or Rose being approached by anyone they didn't recognize. No one witnessed any kind of struggle or disturbance. The absence of any such reports made the random abduction theory difficult to support. Perhaps there had been a dispute with her family. Perhaps she had wanted to start a new life somewhere else. Perhaps she had been planning to leave for some time and had simply carried out that plan on October 24th. But this theory collapsed under even basic scrutiny. Rosa had left her 5-month-old daughter Alicia at home with her sister. No mother planning to disappear would leave an infant behind. Rosa had taken only $10 with her when she left the apartment that afternoon, barely enough to cover the cost of milk and diapers, certainly not enough to travel any significant distance or sustain herself and Rose for more than a few hours. She had not packed any clothing, not for herself, and not for Rose. She had not taken identification documents, birth certificates, or any other papers she would need to establish herself in a new location. In the months following her disappearance, there had been no financial activity in her name, no bank withdrawals, no credit card use, no government assistance applications, no employment records. Rosa Delgado had no money, no resources, and no apparent means to survive on her own. The evidence overwhelmingly indicated that she had not left by choice. The evidence pointing toward his involvement was circumstantial but substantial. Julio was the last person known to have seen Rosa and Rose. A witness had observed them talking outside his mother's apartment just before Rosa went to the grocery store. Julio himself had acknowledged this encounter when questioned by police, but he had provided no useful information about what had been discussed or where Rosa and Rose had gone afterward. More troubling was his behavior in the days and weeks following the disappearance. Julio had stopped calling the Delgado family entirely. He had never once contacted them to ask what had happened to Rosa or whether there was any news about his daughter. He had shown no apparent concern, offered no assistance in the search, expressed no worry about Rosa's safety. Instead, just weeks after Rosa and Rose vanished, Julio had taken legal action to eliminate his child support obligations, going so far as to request a DNA test to challenge paternity, despite having accepted it years earlier. This was not the behavior of a father worried about his missing child. There were other factors that added weight to suspicions about Julio. He had a documented history of domestic aggression, having been terminated from the police department in 1989 for using force against his ex-wife during a dispute. Though he had been reinstated, the incident established a pattern of behavior. He also had a history of forming relationships with multiple women while on duty as a police officer, including Rosa, whom he had met when she was 16 years old. His failure to cooperate with investigators after the initial interviews, his refusal to answer further questions, and his retention of a lawyer all suggested someone who had something to protect or conceal. While none of these factors constituted direct evidence of involvement in the disappearance, they painted a picture of a man whose behavior did not align with innocence. Deborah had clear motive rooted in personal conflict. Rosa represented an ongoing source of tension in Deborah's marriage. Rosa was the woman her husband had been involved with for years, the mother of a child that Julio was legally obligated to support financially. The Delgado sisters had reported that Deborah frequently called their apartment looking for Julio, checking to see if he was with Rosa. 1 week before the disappearance, Deborah had called Antonia Delgado and stated explicitly that Julio no longer wanted his daughter. Then, just days before October 24th, police had responded to Deborah's home and found her with a note expressing intent to end her life. This suggested severe psychological distress. After Rosa and Rose disappeared, Deborah's service weapon was confiscated, and she stopped reporting to work. Like her husband, Deborah refused to cooperate with investigators or provide any information that might help locate Rosa and Rose. Her silence, combined with the timing of her emotional crisis, raised serious questions about what she might have known or been involved in. Professional investigators who reviewed the case offered their assessments based on experience with similar disappearances. Bill Hayes, a former detective with extensive experience in cases involving missing persons, provided analysis, though he was not directly involved in the Hartford investigation. When a young mother and small child vanish completely without leaving any trace, Hayes observed, and the person closest to them refuses to cooperate with investigators, that's the clearest indicator you can have. Hayes also noted that Julio's actions after the disappearance were inconsistent with the behavior of a concerned parent. The conduct after the fact, particularly filing to eliminate child support payments, is completely incompatible with a father who is worried about his child, Hayes said. His assessment reflected what many investigators already suspected. that the answers to what happened to Rosa and Rose likely rested with someone who was refusing to speak. Sources within the Hartford Police Department, speaking privately to reporters, acknowledged that there had been a conflict of interest built into the investigation from the start. Both Julio and Deborah Camacho were police officers in the department that was investigating the disappearance. They were colleagues of the detectives working the case. They knew the procedures, the techniques, the questions that would be asked. This familiarity may have given them advantages in knowing how to respond or not respond to questioning. More significantly, it may have contributed to the slow and cautious approach the department took in the early days of the investigation. The delay in formally questioning Julio, the delay in making the case public, the overall lack of urgency, all of this could be explained, at least in part, by the uncomfortable reality that the primary suspect was one of their own. By early 1998, the investigation had reached an impasse. There was no legal conclusion. No one had been charged with any offense. The case remained open, but without forward momentum. However, when evaluated based on publicly available information and standard investigative analysis, one direction of suspicion remained clearer than any other. Julio Camacho knew what had happened to Rosa Delgado and Rose Camacho, but he had chosen silence. Whether he was directly responsible, whether he had knowledge of someone else's actions, or whether he had simply been present when something went wrong, the evidence of his involvement, or at minimum his knowledge, was substantial. But knowledge and evidence sufficient for prosecution are not the same thing, and the case remained unresolved. Choai 6, Tuain, Fanquiet and Giatuyet Mat Teach. No one has ever been charged in the disappearance of Rosa Delgado and Rose Camacho. The case remains officially open as a cold case, decades after that October afternoon when a mother and daughter walked to a corner store and never returned. No remains have been found. No confession has been made. The case sits in the files of the Hartford Police Department and the FBI, waiting for evidence that has never materialized. The reason no prosecution has occurred is straightforward from a legal standpoint. Under American criminal law, a conviction requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. In the case of Rosa and Rose, there is no direct evidence of what happened to them. There is no location where investigators determined wrongdoing occurred. There is no physical evidence, no biological material, no fingerprints, no DNA. There are no witnesses who saw anyone harm Rosa or Rose. What exists is indirect evidence, patterns of behavior that raise suspicion but do not constitute proof. Julio's refusal to cooperate after initial interviews is suspicious, but not illegal. His filing to eliminate child support is troubling, but not evidence of wrongdoing. Deborah's psychological distress before the disappearance is notable, but does not prove involvement. The motives investigators identified, jealousy, financial pressure, are compelling as theories but insufficient as evidence. American courts require concrete proof that establishes guilt beyond reasonable doubt, and that proof has never been found. Two main theories exist about what happened to Rosa and Rose. The first is that they are alive somewhere, held against their will or living under circumstances preventing contact with family. The Delgado family clung to this hope for years. However, this likelihood has diminished with time. There has been no sign of Rosa or Rose in over 27 years. No financial activity, no medical records, no verified sightings. The more probable scenario is that Rosa and Rose were harmed shortly after they were last seen, and that their remains were hidden in an undiscovered location. Rosa had no reason to disappear voluntarily, and no means to survive on her own. The complete absence of any trace in nearly 3 decades suggests they did not leave by choice. The most plausible reconstruction is that something happened during or after the encounter between Rosa, Rose, and Julio on October 24th. The timing, Deborah's crisis days earlier, her statement that Julio no longer wanted his daughter, his subsequent legal action, all point to increasing tension. Yet this remains theory, not proof. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without confession, it cannot be proven in court. What happened after Rosa and Rose walked away from the grocery store remains unknown. The truth, if it exists, rests with someone who has chosen not to speak. As of 2024, the disappearance of Rosa Delgado and Rose Camacho remains an open case in the files of both the Hartford Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The case has not been closed. Investigators continue to accept any new information that might shed light on what happened on October 24th, 1997. But there have been no significant public updates in over a decade. No new leads have emerged. No witnesses have come forward with information that changed the direction of the investigation. The case exists in a state of suspension, waiting for evidence that may never arrive. The Delgado family still lives in the Hartford area, still waiting for answers that have not come. Antonia Delgado and her sisters keep photographs of Rosa and Rose displayed in their homes, images frozen in time from before that October afternoon. Every year on October 24th, the family gathers at a local church to hold a memorial service. They light candles. They pray. They remember. Antonia has spoken to reporters over the years, and her words carry the weight of nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. "I just want to know the truth," she said in one interview. "Whether it's good news or bad news, I need to know where Rosa and Rose are." The not knowing, she has said, is the hardest part. Grief can eventually find a place to settle, but uncertainty never does. Alicia, the infant who was left behind on that October afternoon, is now 27 years old. She was raised by the Delgado family, growing up in the same apartment building where her mother once lived. Alicia has no memory of Rosa or Rose. She was only 5 months old when they disappeared. Everything she knows about her mother and sister comes from stories told by her aunts, from photographs kept in frames, from the memorial services held every year. She has lived her entire life with the knowledge that her mother walked out one afternoon to buy milk and diapers and never came home. It is a wound that has never healed because it has never been given the chance to close. Julio Camacho, according to public records, continues to live in Connecticut. He has never spoken publicly about the disappearance of Rosa and Rose. He has never given an interview, never issued a statement, never addressed the questions that have surrounded him for 27 years. He eventually retired from the Hartford Police Department, though the exact timing of his retirement is not publicly documented. He has never been charged with any offense related to the disappearance. In the eyes of the law, he remains innocent. But in the eyes of the Delgado family and many who have followed this case, his silence speaks louder than any denial could. Deborah Camacho disappeared from public view after 1998. There is no publicly available information about what happened to her after she was placed on leave from the Hartford Police Department. It is not known whether she returned to police work, whether she remained in Connecticut, or what her life has been since that time. Like her husband, she has never spoken publicly about Rosa and Rose. The questions about what she knew, what she saw, what she might have been involved in, all of those questions remain unanswered. The case has left behind lessons that extend beyond the specifics of what happened to Rosa and Rose. It serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of women in relationships marked by power imbalances, particularly when one person holds authority and the other does not. It raises uncomfortable questions about what happens when police investigate one of their own, about the conflicts of interest that can slow or compromise an investigation, about the ways institutional loyalty can interfere with the pursuit of truth. And it speaks to the particular pain experienced by immigrant families who lose loved ones without explanation, who must navigate systems they may not fully understand while dealing with grief that has no resolution. Antonia Delgado once told a reporter something that captured the impossible hope that families of missing persons carry with them. "Every time I go to the grocery store," she said, "I still hope I'll see Rosa standing somewhere with Rose. I know it's not possible, but my heart still hopes." It is the kind of statement that reveals how loss without closure distorts time, how the mind refuses to fully accept what the heart already knows. Edith Delgado, who was watching baby Alicia on the afternoon Rosa left, has her own memory that will not fade. "I remember Rosa saying, 'Watch Alicia for me, I'll be right back.' But she never came back." That sentence, "I'll be right back," echoes across 27 years, a promise that was never kept. The Delgado family has kept certain items as physical anchors to the people they lost. They still have the pink sweater that Rose was wearing in one of the last photographs taken of her. They keep it carefully stored, a small piece of clothing that has outlasted the child who wore it. There is also an empty milk container, the same type Rosa intended to buy that afternoon, kept as a reminder of an errand that was never completed. 27 years have passed. If Rosa Delgado were alive today, she would be 48 years old. Rose Camacho would be 31. Alicia has grown into adulthood without ever knowing her mother's face or her sister's voice. And somewhere, perhaps, a man knows what happened on that October afternoon, but has chosen to keep that knowledge to himself. The question that remains is whether the truth will ever be spoken, or whether it will remain buried in silence forever, known only to those who refuse to speak. Across the years, this case has remained suspended between absence and unanswered questions. The documents grow older, the memories fade around the edges, yet the silence surrounding the final steps of a young mother and her child continues to hold its place. What endures is the hope carried by those who knew them. Hope that one day a detail, a recollection, or a voice long withheld may bring clarity to a path that vanished in only minutes. If you wish to follow more investigations told with care, respect, and a commitment to truth, you may subscribe and share your thoughts below. Each interaction helps ensure that stories like this one are not forgotten and that the search for answers continues.